My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to ChinaEconTalk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, here today with the China Tech Investor podcast team, Elliot Zagman and James Hull, talking today about e-commerce in China, the lessons that Facebook is apparently learning from WeChat, as well as the value or lack thereof in picking individual stocks to invest in. Elliot and James, welcome to ChinaEconTalk.
Great to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, it's good to be in the same place. You know, usually when James and I record, we're in, God knows wherever. And I know that's kind of the situation with you too, isn't it, Jordan?
Lots of remote interviews. So, Elliot, I hear you've been trampsing around live streaming studios in southern China.
Yeah, well, I'm on a Grand China tour for the month of March. So I've been in Hong Kong, Shanghai, up in Beijing right now for about 10 days. And then I was in Hangzhou earlier for about a week. For those who listen to our podcast, the China Tech Investor podcast, powered by TechNode, they'll know that, I'm a columnist and obviously a podcast host, but I also work a lot as kind of a PR consultant, usually for China tech founders, usually of either pre-IPO or recently IPO'd, kind of small cap companies, $1 to $2 to $3 billion. But one company that I work for is a company called Mogu, like mushroom, basically.
Okay.
I talked about them a little bit. But what they do is, they invited me to just kind of come and hang out for a week with them in Hangzhou, and they do a lot of these fashion live streams, where basically what they have is these these key opinion leaders, these influencers who will do these maybe 4 or 5 hour live streams every night. They're usually funny. They're these very good improvisers, and they'll just sell clothes or cosmetics or whatnot. And a lot of them, they'll just make a killing. But one of them that I visited was this girl named a young woman named Xiao Jianxin, or Little Sweetheart. So, and I thought they were going to say, you're going to visit some of our influencers. And what I was thinking is, I'm going to visit this girl's apartment. She's going to have, one of those circle lights set up. And, that's what I imagined, basically. We get there. It's a warehouse outside the city, right? Her husband comes down to meet us, and he goes, do you want to come and take a look at our whole facility here? A whole facility? Like, what is this? So they send us over to this big warehouse space. There's an assembly line where there are basically they said they have 60 different workers who are all basically inspecting clothes that she sells during her live stream, and then you have a whole another assembly line of people basically just packing them up and shipping them out. So they do millions of US dollars in sales per month.
Jesus.
Yeah, they do. So
just this, again, this is just the husband and wife team featuring the 5 hour, very cute, very compelling live streamer.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like QVC.
Okay.
Or Home Shopping Network or something like that. But it's online.
By the way, when I was a kid, I remember those like baseball card ones. And then my whole vision of adulthood would be like, one day I am going to like have $80 to buy a Mickey Mantle signed card or whatever. And now I have $80 to buy a Mickey Mantle signed card and am not. But apparently, the dream, the business model still lives, most certainly.
Yeah. So, they also have like a big customer service team. Basically, what the main show is up in this room, they have a studio, and it's this young woman, this girl from this, small town in Henan. She's a pretty normal, Chinese girl, but you could tell probably she's not, super educated or professionally polished or anything. She's just a young woman. And her sister, basically for 5 hours each night, 7 days a week, they will live stream to 1 to 2 million people.
Yeah.
And
Casual.
they have a huge rack of clothes, all of which they have purchased directly from these factories. And they basically all curate themselves. And then they will basically, her husband, who runs this with her, and some other colleagues, are basically just selling them as they're showing them. So she's curating them, selling them, and just basically buying directly from the factories and then sending them right through her warehouse and then sending them on out.
What are like kind of the costs, the prices they're selling these items for? Like, what kind of range are we talking about?
For these guys, it's pretty cheap. So basically what they're doing is it's probably similar quality to something that you might get at Zara, but it's probably half the price.
Yeah.
Right? So we've seen this a lot with like Taobao, right? Just go on Taobao, you can get all that clothes. But we also know with Taobao that there's a quality issue.
Yeah.
Right. So in China, I think if you live here for a while, I mean, this is I think a little uniquely China, but not exclusively China, is that people don't always trust those like systems, right? What they do trust is somebody that they know, right? And if someone says, "Oh, you can trust this person, you can trust this company," they're like, "Yeah, cool, I'll go with it." And that's really where live streamers have filled this this hole, right? Fallen into this void where, if I don't know, I want to get some clothes, but I don't know if they're good or not. I know that I can trust what Xiao Tianxin is good, right? So, or says is good. And I think we see this on Instagram a lot too. It's where it's starting to come up. But I think in China, it's they're just light years ahead, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You look at Instagram. I don't spend my Instagram time, looking at, Kylie Jenner or these kind of folks.
Right.
But from what I understand, you can do some e-commerce, but you basically have to click on something, then it'll take you to another site. It's not really, closely integrated or seamlessly
I think
integrated.
they did a beta sort of test or some sort of test with Kate Spade, where Kate Spade had an ad, and you click it, and it would open up. It's still in Instagram, but it's like another interface. So but you could make a purchase through Instagram. Was the whole thing? This was last year, I think. Yeah.
I do find it interesting. There's this new documentary. I forget the name of it. It kind of paints the world of live streaming as this like
People's Desire.
Yeah,
like
People's Desire.
People's
Desire,
Republic
yeah.
of Desire.
Yeah. And there's like there is like a kind of hellscape aspect to this world. But I think it's also important to understand that there's actually a lot of talent that goes into it. Just because you are young and pretty does not get you a million followers buying all your stuff. As you said, there's an aspect of entertainment and being engaging, and especially if you're like a woman and your audience are females, like sex appeal is not going to be what wins you followers in the end.
Exactly.
So I mean, there's a real art. I mean, I don't know about art form, but there's a lot of preparation and skill that really goes into this, and being able to keep people entertained and coming back to you on a day-to-day basis. And trust is a pretty difficult thing to build live streaming over a phone, right?
Exactly. You have
watching
to have that.
every once in a while, and to be able to do that, I think is something really remarkable.
So one of the cool things in People's Republic of Desire was because you could, as a viewer of these influencers, you could interact with them, and you could start to develop a connection or some sort of relationship with them, and you would they become almost like your friend, like you wanted to spend time watching them on their show and listening to them, and they were saying things that you identified with in your life that you weren't even able to verbalize, right?
Yeah.
And so it created this cool kind of, and I think, that documentary is great. I really liked it, but it got at this kind of, that there's something lacking for the young people here, where they can't find like people that really cater to their views or their situations and circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about this because, I mean, normally I try to keep, what I do, professionally or for money away from what I do as like
journalism.
Yeah. So it's a little, I have to be very delicate here. But yeah, I do think, visiting these people, like it's not, you can tell like their lives are not always easy. In some ways I compared it to a professional athlete, like the amount that they're working and the amount that you can tell there is a physical toll that I think it takes on a lot of them.
Yeah.
They don't know how long the success is going to last, and they're very successful. And there are a lot worse ways to make, and a lot more dishonest ways to make a success out of yourself,
Yeah.
and they're doing well. They're setting up their families, and for a lot of these people, they could probably stop doing this after a couple of years and be set for life, if for the really successful ones. And yeah, that is something that I did notice with that one young woman that I saw, is that she had excellent improv skills.
Yeah.
Like her and her sister were standing there in front of the live stream, and they're basically, going back and forth, changing, just from outfit to outfit to outfit to outfit. And at the same time, she's talking to her audience. She's making jokes. She's this incredibly likable person and very, very funny. And you can see she's just, like I said, she is, I don't want to say, I think it can be taken the wrong way to say she's just some girl from Henan, but she also is like a girl next door. You know,
Yeah.
you could tell she's not from like a super educated or super rich family. She's not super glamorous. You can tell if you are just your average 20-something young woman in, you know, a small, you know, not from Beijing or Shanghai, but from a, you know, a third or fourth tier city in China, you know, I can see why they would really resonate with her. And she's probably making these people's lives a little bit better, bringing a little happiness to them.
Yeah.
Giving them, you know, a reason to buy a product, you know, and you know, I think that, you know, obviously there are always downsides of things like this, and, you know, new aspects of the digital economy. But I think that if you're against that, I think, you know, you're against a lot of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. I mean, who's losing out? Like Zara and H&M,
Right.
right? Like these are the folks that these people are stealing market share from. So it's an interesting trend, and it's like, you know, it's a real long tail thing. It's a real internet enabled thing, and these are little small and medium sized businesses, and it'll be interesting to see which ones of them are going to create the Gucci's and Pradas of China 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and that's I think what's so cool about it is that I also visited, you know, in like Zhejiang and Guangdong, both basically have, you know, the entire kind of fashion, you know, value chain ecosystem, all in just a couple square miles of each other, really. Yeah. I mean, you have the designers from Gucci or Chanel or whatever that come and say, okay, well, this is what's in style this year, but the whole rest of it, from, you know, the mid to low tier designers, you know, that will design the clothes for, say, Zara. A lot of them are Chinese, and then they basically just show the Zara people, like, you know, these are the designs we might want to do this year. Pick them out and say which ones you want to go with, and then, you know, we'll make them. And so you have, you know, the fabric, the manufacturing, the wholesale. There's so much of this that is all just in this small ecosystem, and a lot of these people that are really kind of these budding designers. So you have all this design talent down there too, where, you know, I think over the next few years we can really start to see some of these homegrown Chinese brands that, you know, will they be successful abroad? I don't know, but they'll definitely have some success in China, that's for sure.
Sure. I recently read this book called Amatora, which was this, I think, American who's been in and around Japan for a long time, writing about the evolution of men's fashion in Japan since 1945. And it told this fascinating arc of Japan evolving from a fashion society that was very buttoned down, very tight, and slowly but surely getting these new influences from the West and taking their own spin on things and craving this sort of authenticity and kind of growing and evolving to, you know, the streetwear and the bathing apes of the world. And now Japan is commonly acknowledged as like a premier fashion, you know, a global fashion capital that you know, fashionistas all around the world get cues from. And it was interesting thinking about reading this book and thinking about the ingredients that they needed for that success. So first, I think the guy talked about the importance of having this kind of global influence and global mindset. A lot of the first cues that the Japanese took to bring in more global influences came from the American occupation and all these GIs running around, and they're the ones with the money and they have the cool clothes and whatnot. And so that was kind of the first big influx. And then it also took disposable income of people being willing to spend on quality, which is obviously something that China has in spades. But the other really interesting aspect was this idea of these, you know, kind of pretty out there individuals who cared a lot about a particular subculture and were willing to live very alternative lifestyles and invest their toil and labor into creating fantastic products that were edgy, and that the police weren't necessarily happy seeing kids walking around in Shibuya. And there's I think a general idea of cool fashion being something that has to be pissing older people off and being against the mainstream societal grain and being something that's a little subversive. And it's an open question whether that last ingredient of like toleration of subversiveness is something or not even necessarily toleration, but like, you know, not risking going to jail for subversiveness is something that you are going to end up seeing in the Chinese fashion world. So, you know, I mean, I'm watching this terrible iQIYI.
Dou Ting Hao.
No, it's like Chun Yan's. It's like a American Idol, but for male idols who are all like 18 to 25. And at some point, I think 2 weeks ago, the government decided that all the hair had to be black. So
no tattoos.
Yeah, so not just no tattoos, but no blonde highlights. So Aichi had to go back and remaster the whole episode. This these 3-hour long episodes, and just do the Photoshop pour black paint on all their heads, and it looked absurd.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, this is if you want to rebel against something, here you go, right? But at the same time, it's an interesting tension between having societal things you can push back against and just being too quashed that your idea never ends up getting the traction it needs to take you places. So.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned iQIYI because so James and I on our podcast, for those of you who don't listen to our podcast regularly, we have a watch list of different Chinese tech companies that we kind of follow their stocks. We follow their quarterly earnings and just keep track of them. And one of them is iQIYI. And this is a common discussion that we have when it comes to iQIYI, is that they have a potential overseas market with their content. They could be a potential global competitor to Netflix, but that is an issue, is that how can they make content that is, globally appealing and globally competitive when there are a lot more restrictions on what kind of content can be published within China.
Yeah, and if they have to double produce things that are completely different, it's just the cost of it it outweighs the benefit, right?
Yeah.
That's it. This is an interesting idea. I mean, how subversive do you have to be considered cool? Could you be subtly subversive? You have one streak of a blonde highlight, and that's subversive enough.
Yeah.
Or a mischievous grin.
Right.
All it takes is a look, right? Turning now to the relatively recent news with regards to Facebook's big new privacy push. A lot of Western as well as Chinese media, I've seen a few WeChat articles about this, talking about how a lot of the cues that Facebook is taking seem to be coming directly from Tencent and the social media ecosystem that WeChat has spawned. So any thoughts about this? What's going on here? And where do you see the differences when it comes to data privacy and the like coming from a consumer perspective?
Okay, I guess I'll start. So I think Facebook bought WhatsApp in 2014. I kind of thought when they bought it that they would start immediately implementing kind of a WeChat clone, bringing in more groups and kind of having a moments thing added to it, but then you're kind of competing with Facebook feed. When Mark did his memo, he did talk about, how privacy, encryption, and kind of the one-to-one or one to a small group of people kind of communications and ephemeralness of stories is the major growth area for social media right now. Mm-hmm. China, I don't think many people talk about privacy or their ideals of privacy or how they view, whether the government's collecting data on them. But I think people are aware of it. I just don't think it's talked about very much.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I think also in the last year that I've noticed has changed. But yeah, I don't see it being talked about on Chinese social media. But I do when I talk to my friends in China, and my friends obviously are not representative of the average Chinese citizen, but I do hear them talking about privacy in ways that they never did before. They're far more aware of it now. Or when I know a lot of these reports about the social credit system in China, I think a lot of it is overhyped, particularly from mainstream media overseas. But even when I've said to Chinese friends something like, oh, well, there are a lot of positive things that can come out of it. A lot of my Chinese friends will be like, no, that's scary.
Yeah.
And I do think that, it is a complex issue, but I've been surprised by how many of my Chinese friends are a little, freaked out by it. But also, they're not representative of the average Chinese person. They're in Beijing. They're wealthier. They're more educated than the average Chinese person.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of my takeaway on that. But with I do think that we've seen just a pretty big, just kind of global. How to say a changing a paradigm shift. There we go. Yeah. When it comes to privacy, and it is a very important discussion, but we see this with GDPR in Europe where I think James and I have talked about this before, and just about everybody I know has been reading that Shoshana Zuboff, the Surveillance Capitalism book. I'm listening to it right now. I don't read books; I listen to books. But basically, she goes into great detail about how many of these business models are based on basically extracting data from our lived experience, and using them for profit, but also using them for predictive kind of manipulation of our behavior, right? So James and I have talked about this before. I don't know if we recorded this, but we talked about Pokemon Go, for example, and how one monetization option for Pokemon Go is that they allowed, like Burger King can sponsor Pokemon Go, and then the Pokemon Gym is at Burger King, right? So, and this is one thing. I mean, it's in the U.S. I think it's more about like how just the whole like capitalist system and the financial system can just completely walk away with it. But in China, there's the financial component and the capitalistic component, but there's also the social control component as well, politically, that I think is also in thought about from by a lot of people as well. So, and one thing I think that WeChat does do is I don't see that too much from WeChat, at least at this point.
You mean the gathering and trying to manipulate and kind of nudge you certain ways, gathering of your data? Yeah, I mean, they haven't really opened their ecosystem up to advertisers. Like the ads I do see on WeChat, which I've been seeing more of, but the ones I do see seem to be pretty well curated and more like design, like cool, high quality. And maybe that's because they're targeting me for something, but I don't know. Yeah.
I think it's interesting just kind of imagining what real privacy would look like on the Facebook platform, which I think we can get a little peek in through our experience of WeChat. So you want to talk about a little bit about how contacts lists work and how that ends up meaning you have a radically different kind of understanding and relationship to all these people as opposed to being a Facebook friend with them?
Well, yeah.
I mean, the biggest difference, right, is that, on WeChat, you add someone, and usually the first thing you do when you add someone is you can like tag them or like set your preferences, whatever, to, if they're like work, you can tag them as work related, whatever. But you also look at their moments, and you can scroll through someone's moments and you can start to see like your other contacts that you're connected to on WeChat have liked their moments. And that means that you have a similar connection. Whereas there's no really other way to see that, right?
Yeah. There's on Facebook, you click see one's like, oh, we have 70 common
it's
friends.
Very
like, I know
obvious.
exactly who you know. Like I know where you work. I know what football team you like and whatnot. I mean, there's just much less on there from a public profile standpoint and from a just general information that you can glean from someone's public WeChat profile.
And it's I think another thing to keep into consideration here is just the business models of Facebook versus Tencent, and that we've talked about this because Tencent's obviously on one of the companies on our watch list, is that Facebook's main business is the ads. Tencent has a very diversified revenue stream, basically. So they have gaming, and
it's
gaming
majority
has been
gaming.
It's majority gaming, yeah. But they're also going into a number of different avenues. They have they've invested very
and gaming
successfully.
is ridiculous, like very profitable, and it can fund loss leaders kind of things like WeChat. I mean, I think Alan Zhang, right, the main goal with WeChat was to make it useful to your life, whereas the main goal for Facebook was to connect everybody, and the connection would lead to better outcomes for Facebook. But then there's that really, and I think it's in the book, but there's that memo that came out from the Facebook kind of VP or something about how connections and openness is always good, even if it leads to violence, even if it leads to like bad things that happen in the world, it's still good for Facebook. So we must drive for it. So it's like this. It's actually
cultish almost. It's extremist.
It's gone beyond morals. Like they're literally, they've gone over the deep end. I don't know. I kind of fall in the camp where I think they probably should be broken up. I actually think Mark Zuckerberg should support that, because I think he'll get wealthier when it's broken up, because he'll own all these separate things and they all do well.
He'll get Rockefellered.
Rockefeller, same thing happened to him. But anyway, I think I don't know if Apple should be broken up, but anyway, I don't want to take the conversation there unless we want to go there.
Excuse me. Another great book that I read recently is The Four by Scott Galloway. So he looks into Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google. You know, he's a compelling writer, and just really looks at these. Does a good job of looking at these companies from many different angles. But yeah, it was a very eye opening. But one thing that I wonder about, and this gets back to the investment and the stock thing, is that I believe Google was the first company, or the first tech IPO to issue the two separate classes of shares, right? That kept Sergey and Larry basically in charge of the company, and this is also what keeps Mark Zuckerberg in charge.
Right.
Of the company.
I don't know if they were the first, but maybe. Yeah.
One of the first big one. I don't know. This is what we could fact check me on that one, but I think it does create. I mean, these people they have a very specific set of experiences that is, you know, leading them to have a very specific worldview, and they don't often have a lot of people telling them no. They don't hear a lot of different perspectives all the time, and I think what it has created is a sense of kind of, I guess, like a Silicon Valley fundamentalism, I think might be one way to put it, in that we're seeing kind of the negative side of right now, in that like in Facebook's case is connection is always better.
Yeah.
Right. Where they build up this kind of, it's almost a cult-like, attitude. And I think we also saw this, I think, in some ways, in looking back at like the Arab Spring.
Look at the New Zealand shooting that just happened. I mean, that's connection. That was live streamed, and that's not good for the world.
But at least we're acknowledging and that's bad.
Right.
I think during the Arab Spring, I think, looking back, I think there's a whole lot of ways that we maybe didn't foresee a lot of, the effect
negative.
That it have.
Yeah.
But there was a very much like, oh, Facebook and Twitter are causing democratic revolutions, right? And
there was a sense of pride from that. I remember.
Yeah, but like this idea that like Thomas Jefferson was just gonna arise in Egypt, right, and create this like a liberal democracy in Egypt.
That's a little 2020.
Yeah,
there, but,
2020 hindsight.
Going back to China a bit, it's interesting because there's that Big Four book. I'm still waiting to read that one about China. There's a fair number of books covering individual companies. I've found most of them to be very hagiographic, very much like, look at how awesome and brilliant the founder is.
Access journalism.
Yeah, and like half of them have been written by BCG partners, no offense to BCG, but it's, if you work as a consultant for these companies for 20 years and then it's kind of hard to expect people to write a real critical.
Yeah. You've been giving them ideas that they've implemented that you're tied to in some way. Yeah.
So, maybe the book is out there and I haven't found it yet, but it's, there's so much to write about when it comes to, doing like big comparative analysis of these Chinese ecosystem companies. And, as I'm sure you guys have talked about and I've talked about on my show, it's like as these companies grow more and more and have more and more of a global imprint, it's really important to understand what makes them tick. So looking forward for the next generation of journalists, both domestically in China and then foreigners coming in to take a real critical eye and really understand what makes these places work, because understanding them, just like understanding Facebook, is really important if you want to know what's going on in the 21st century. It's going to be the same for a lot of these Chinese firms.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that. Well, actually, I just spoke at a bookworm event on a panel with the global VP of PR at Huawei and Josh Shin from the Wall Street Journal, and that's basically was my argument with Huawei is that like I don't know. I've written a lot about Huawei. Like I don't know whether or not what the U.S. government is accusing them of is true or false. Like I started writing about them, just about their company culture. And some of the issues that they had there, and it was nothing political, and the whole political thing kind of, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable with them. But like that's ultimately my issue here, is that they're such an important company. They will write a lot of the rules, especially in the developing world, for the future of connectivity. And if we don't know enough about that company, and if they continue to be as closed as they are, right, I do believe that is kind of a disservice to to the world, right? And I think that they have a different set of a degree of responsibility. But that is true with a lot of these Chinese tech companies. But one thing I do notice, and I think what makes Huawei a little bit different, is that Ren Zhengfei is 75 years old. He's an older generation, 74.
Yeah.
You'll see that there's generally, Alibaba has been more open than Huawei has been until maybe just recently with Huawei. And now with a lot of the companies that I work with, these are younger 30-something founders and entrepreneurs. Also, I think what I like about it is that they're a lot smaller, so they don't have, all the same kind of things to worry about as the bigger companies. But they're very. I find it just. It's much easier to have an open conversation about who they are, what they're trying to do, and what their business models are, what kind of cultures they want to build. And they are very, very forward thinking about that. And that's also why I do like, I'm so encouraged by kind of the 80-后, the post 80s entrepreneurial generation, is because I find them to be just, not only are they, super hardworking and entrepreneurial, but they're very forward thinking. I would say that a lot of them are far more, they're more humanistic. So I think in the future, we're going to get probably a much more accurate book about the Chinese entrepreneurs that have kind of come of age in the last few years than we had with, for example, like, the Alibaba book by Duncan Clark, which is, a little bit of an advertisement for the company.
Yeah. So today's podcast is sponsored by the University of San Francisco. You know what's cool? Grad school. And not those sorts of grad schools when you finish with lots of debt and not a lot of employability, but a grad school where you learn a skill set that gives you 6-figure jobs at employers with rock climbing gyms and free mango lychee smoothies. At USF's Masters in Applied Economics, in 2 years, you'll get the economics and data science training to work at top tech firms and policy bodies. Plus, for those non-US students out there, this program is designated STEM, so you can keep working in the US for 3 years after you graduate with no visa issues. To learn more and get a free application waiver, go to usfca.edu/Jordan. Now accepting applications for this fall. Just to preview an episode I have coming out in a little bit with Christopher Marquise, who's a researcher, and basically what he's done is try to understand like how living through the Great Leap Forward and living through the Cultural Revolution impacted your decision making. And he does it. He looks at these data sets that are it's like, are you more conservative because you lived through you were living in a city that like had big food shortages or something. But it's not just that you're less comfortable raising debt, right? It's also that you grew up in a universe in which foreigners were devils, and you were imbibed with this very red ideology. And growing as you were talking about the 80s generation and the 90s generation even more, is it's a more global, it's a more open mindset that values different things, that has different priorities. And watching how that plays out is going to be one of the fascinating stories of the 21st century.
Yeah, so, and it's one of the things that makes me most optimistic about China and the Chinese economy and China's place in the world.
Have you recorded that episode yet?
Thursday morning.
I do wonder, like, one of my kind of hypotheses has been that the people who lived through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all that, they tend to value more so than other generations stability. And that because they lived through such unstable, just ridiculous environments and had to really struggle and sort of survive, right? I think like eventually maybe 4 or 5 generations down the road, which is like 80 to 100 years, that might kind of peter out, and kind of this emphasis on stability might eventually kind of get loosened.
Yeah, I mean, I think just this is a global phenomenon, right? Like my grandparents, they lived through the Great Depression, and my parents had a bit of that growing up, and like here I am having this really weird life path and like hanging out in China. And had I been closer to that kind of like seminal sociological event, maybe I would most certainly have a different sort of risk tolerance and different and different mindset. So this is a global thing, not just a China story. Though I would say the extremes of what happened in 20th century China, I think, are as crazy as you get if you want to pick a lifetime arc.
Yeah, if you look at World War II and the people who fought there, I mean that was not as long as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. I mean, it was probably on the same similar magnitude of like disruptive, but not as long.
But and I also do think that this has a lot to do with these. This is for a long time, this has kind of been a big issue of mine and kind of something I've been trying to like wrestle with and like just kind of asking why, is just the transparency issue, not just with like the Communist Party or whatnot with China, but a lot of these companies as well. Like why can't they be more open and honest with their consumers and with the public about just what they are as a company, especially because a lot of times the companies aren't that bad, right? There's nothing really that, like,
Yeah.
what are they hiding? But I do think,
But it's
like,
hard to prove, right? The problem is that, like, if everyone expects something and then you have to prove that you're not that, it's like anything you say that says you're not, it's sort of like,
Yeah, Huawei. Huawei.
do you-
It's really hard to win at this point.
Yeah.
But-
well, I would argue with Huawei though. At this point, like, it's hard to come back at this point. But like, part of it is like
They could have done
that
something
they've done,
better.
that they've been doing this for
more
decades.
proactive.
Yeah, but I do think if you look at the stories from like the Cultural Revolution, it was a lot of and I don't I'm very hesitant to get too into like Ren Zhengfei's psyche or anything like that.
Yeah.
But you did have where first of all, trust was just destroyed in a lot of these cities.
Sure.
Where you just had neighbor going after neighbor, family going after family, and something that was okay just a few days ago, or a political leader who you'd support just a few weeks ago, right? And that was fine. All of a sudden, that makes you a counter-revolutionary or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you do in that situation? What's the wisest move? The wisest move is just to not say anything.
Yeah.
Because saying anything, you don't know if it's going to get you in trouble later. So you can understand a little bit from that perspective. But also, I could see how that impacts a lot of people. I don't know about him in particular, but I think in that generation, that's definitely there.
Okay, so now let's turn to the whole idea of stock picking in the first place. I'm a big skeptic when it comes to the thesis that any individual kind of sitting at home at their desk doing research can have a better sense than the market of what's actually happening. And thinking that you can and putting all your money into stocks as opposed to holding a more diversified portfolio ends up being something I think that's very dangerous and more risky than people have a general understanding of, particularly if they have a relatively short time horizon and haven't lived through big crises.
Yeah.
And ends up being something dangerous. And on the one hand, I think like the idea of holding a few $100s of this and a few $100s of that as sort of like a hobby and a way to keep up on the industry and have a bit of skin in the game to be an interesting one. But having it be a main part of what you're doing with your retirement funds and your kids' college tuition, I find dangerous and frankly irresponsible. So I'm curious what you guys think about the potential validity of being an independent investor and trying to pick stocks and make money coming in and out of the market.
Okay. Generally, when it comes to this, to like the investing, I tend to be the dumb one, and James tends to be the smart one. I'm dumb and loud. James is smart and quiet.
First of all, I don't know. I would start off with saying like investing is very, very, very difficult. It is not something to do and just kind of lightly, sprinkle something here and there and think everything's going to work out. Diversification is incredibly important. Owning real estate is a good idea. That's usually very different than the market, although can be similar. Owning some bonds and things. Being diversified is definitely worth it. For me, like I started looking at stocks when I was a kid. And like anytime I made money, I put it in a brokerage account and I've kind of managed it and kind of, I've obviously lost money here and there. I've made some money here and there. But what I found that works for me is you have to kind of lengthen your patience and your time horizon. You can't one of the problems that we have is like for psychology for individuals is, we have fear, we have greed, we have cognitive biases, we experience FOMO. You have to fight these urges and it's really actually very difficult to do. The best thing to do is be extremely patient, do research, have a sort of process or some sort of thesis that you like, and you have to develop that and refine it over time. Another problem that makes it even harder is that there's just so much, especially these days. It was different in the 80s before Reg FD and that, but even now, like there's just so much more information and there's so much more information masquerading as fact and opinion masquerading as fact. And so it's hard to actually weed through the signal and the noise. And so, I don't know, I think it's something you have to kind of figure out how to do, and it takes a lot of time, and you have to kind of build the skills to do it, and you have to read a lot of primary source stuff. And it's fun to follow markets. It's fun to follow stocks. You learn about what companies are doing. You learn about interesting business ideas, which you can apply. You can take an idea from one industry and apply it to your work. You can take, ideas that are going on in China, and you can apply them to what you're doing in the US. So studying companies is fascinating. I mean, there's more interesting stuff there to me. I mean, I'm not a sports guy. I like to play sports. I don't really follow sports, but I really like following companies.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say, I'm very much on the same page as James here. And I don't necessarily disagree with that much about what you said at all, really. But the joke that I always will say when it comes to stock picking is what I also like to do? I also like to bet on NBA games.
Yeah.
I don't I'm probably, when it comes to NBA games, I'm probably 50-50. I'm probably pretty much out even, I win as much as I lose, but it makes the games a lot more interesting, and I understand basketball a lot better. And I make a lot more money with stocks than I do on NBA games, but I'm half joking here, but I do diversify a lot, right? So my personal account, my play account is probably, I don't want to go too much into detail, but the account that I have to play with is a single digit percentage of my entire net worth, right?
Yeah.
So that's just my personal situation. With James, I think it's a good amount more, because he also spends a lot more time looking into this.
Yeah.
But for me, it's about a reason to learn more about this, right?
Sure.
So one of kind of the inspirations for me to start this podcast was I was always a big fan of the Motley Fool. So they have a podcast network, they have a website, they have advisory services, all looking into it's all for stock investors, right? And I do think it's very important to have a reason to pay attention to markets and have a reason to pay attention to companies, so that you can learn how markets work, right? Learn how companies work, and it gives you an incentive to be educated in this kind of stuff, right? And that's basically, that was a big impetus for me to want to do the podcast. Also because James does look into this a lot more into detail. So a lot of it was an excuse for me. I had a beer with James, and I was like, I want to talk to this guy more. This is gonna be an excuse to talk to him once a week.
Yeah.
But it's I also think with Chinese tech companies, they are so interesting. The characters around them are so fascinating. But they're also it's a different world here in China. They're different companies. And if you're looking at them from the outside and you assume a lot of the assumptions that you might have in the US or in Europe or wherever with a Chinese company, a lot of those things might hurt you, right? So, you have the common example of, I've mentioned this in an article I wrote a while ago, but the divergent evolution, right? We use the example of the giraffe and the okapi. So millions of years ago, there was this common ancestor. It was basically like a deer in the jungles of Central Africa, right? And some of those went out onto the savannah, and they evolved longer legs, longer neck. They become a giraffe. And then in the jungles of Africa now, there's this thing called an okapi, which is basically just a deer, a big deer, right? So you have this one animal that in a different ecosystem becomes this very majestic, beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And this other one that doesn't really change very much. And we do get this with the internet in China, where you have, for example, Google and Baidu, where you had Baidu basically, they start off as a very similar company. They're both search companies, and they both try to go into AI, and Google has succeeded much better than Baidu has, although Baidu has had some success. But Baidu right now is about a $60-70 billion company, and Google is 400-500 billion or more. Well, I don't know the market cap right now, but they've become the giraffe in that situation.
Yeah.
Right. And Baidu has struggled. Likewise, Meituan and Groupon. Right. So Meituan basically started as a Groupon clone. Where's Groupon now? They're not doing that well. And Meituan is worth what, 50 billion?
I forget.
Billion?
Around there. It's big and important.
Yeah.
I think that's Hong Kong
they're
dollars.
Yeah. No, the USD is some.
Really?
It's like 50 billion. All right, anyways, but yeah, but in that case, they've been the giraffe, right? So it's if you aren't actually seeing how these companies work on the ground in China, and also if you're not really looking into their numbers, it can be hard to really get a clear grasp on them. And then also, there has the issue of fraud in the numbers of these companies coming out of China is not exactly, it's in a greater than zero chance, right?
Yeah.
And it's not something that's never happened before. And we do often talk about how when there are certain numbers from certain companies that might look fishy, right? Or that it's really difficult for them to audit that. And that is something that, we want to draw attention to and talk about if it's there as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna pick stocks, I mean, you have to pay attention to the details of the companies, right? I mean, and especially for Chinese tech stocks where you have these business model innovations that create very bizarre new accounting line items and things that have to get defined, and I'm sure their auditors have headaches over trying to figure out what these things are. You need to try to figure that out. That's sort of a plug for an article coming out on Pinduoduo that I've written. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I just think in general, you look at these studies of professional asset managers and the best of the hedge funds of the world, and they're basically a coin toss. So the idea that you can sit around and, you don't have a giant research staff and you don't have a professional background and you don't have the type of access that real investors with billions of dollars to throw around get at these companies. The idea that you can beat them at their game is a fool's errand, in my opinion. So from your perspective, Elliot, like, yes, as a way to pay attention to this stuff, I think it makes complete sense. And if you can make $100 here or there, then like, yeah, you're gonna read that extra article you would, as opposed to watching another episode of a TV show or something that may have less ultimate value to your life or your career. But I would caution everyone to be worried and be nervous and be aware of the fact
stocks
that
go down sometimes.
Yeah, be risk averse.
Stocks go down, and there are big macro things that you can't control and have no visibility into and don't really understand that could potentially take a big chunk of your of money that you worked hard to earn away. So yeah, as a hobby, by all means, as a way to inform your what you're doing in your day job, by all means, but but letting a few early wins get to your head and let you think that you are some sage oracle or the next Warren Buffett, I think is a real fool's errand. And it's fascinating watching that having happened to a number of Chinese who've gotten very rich very fast. This is something that you've seen a lot in the domestic wealth management industry, where people kind of pile into hot things that aren't necessarily all that, not the smartest money, maybe more newer money, and then all of a sudden they just get wiped out.
I mean, I think that's in not just public markets, that's in private markets, private equity, VC as well.
Absolutely.
People chasing the hot thing. That's part of like FOMO that you have to be careful of. The thing is, professional investors that are, some of them use satellites. They're tracking how many cars are parked in, parking lots at Walmart every day, and they're trying to use that to guess what their revenues are on a daily basis and make investments and bets on that next quarter's statements.
Yeah, I saw a great thing about how people are now using Kuaishou, which is this like kind of rural live streaming app to understand farming prices. Who would have known? I mean, there are just so many data sets that you do not have access to and cannot process that
amount of data. That's the problem. Is it's a processing data problem. But I mean, the problem is those guys are playing a short-term game, and the game that an individual can win at still. It happens to be, I think it's the only one that still exists, the edge that still exists, is to play a longer term game where you're not trying to hit like a quarterly return or monthly return sort of benchmark. You put some of your money in bonds, and when stocks go down, you buy them, and you kind of pick some stocks you like, you follow them a little bit, and when they go down, you add to them. It's almost sounds so simple that you'd think, oh, it has to be more complicated than that. In reality, when you try to do it, it is very psychologically difficult.
I think another thing is that I try to do, and you guys can correct. I don't know the data here specifically. Is to identify trends, like long-term trends, and invest in them. So like one thing that I think is a pretty reliable trend going forward is the world going cashless, right? So we've seen it here in China. No one really uses cash. I came here with like 2,000 RMB in cash, and I still have not even spent 1,000 of it, after being here for like 3 weeks. And I do think that we can be pretty confident the world's going that direction. So if you look at, okay, well, you got Visa, MasterCard, Square, PayPal, Alibaba or Ant Financial, Tencent. You have the key movers in this area, and if you get a basket of them, right, you're betting on that trend, right? And some might do better than others, but I think generally, it'll play out in the right direction.
No. This is not a novel insight that you have.
Okay.
This has been priced in. There are plenty of people who have been thinking about and evaluating this over time. The idea that the world going cashless is going to be the predominant driver of these companies' fortunes, or like the average of these companies' fortunes going forward, I think is not necessarily all that reflective of reality. There are many other things that are happening within the financial services industry, within all these different companies. I mean, Tencent, it's a gaming company. To what extent WeChat Pay plays into that? 40% of their revenues are from, I think even more than 40% of their revenues are dependent on what the Chinese government thinks is a good, what the Chinese government thinks gaming should be, what role gaming should play in Chinese society. Yeah. So, it's very nice thinking about betting on big trends, and this may be a more fruitful thing if you're a VC investor and you have a high degree of confidence that this one type of biotechnology is going to be the one that's going to change the world in the next 20 years, and you can bet on the 20 companies that you think have the smartest researchers that are going to be able to make this technology come to pass. But if you're talking about things that are like already like out in the public markets, that people have already done a lot of research on, that there's already a lot of understanding of, having that kind of ill-defined a vision, and then making and then like putting some money on 24 on the roulette table and some money on 26 and kind of hoping it works out. I think there are going to be a lot of other things driving all those stocks and driving that return on that bet that don't necessarily have to do with your insight, which may or may not end up being the case in the first place.
It could be true. I think Tencent may have not been the perfect example along with the rest of them, and I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I think
a lot of things you'll see, even for professional and managers, they'll have a thesis that is based on some sort of trend that they see, but they'll look at each individual company and analyze it on a much broader level than just that trend. But that's part of the reason why they're looking at that company is it's within that broader. So it's like the biggest one that's been the story in China for like 15 years is consumer. Yeah. Consumer China is created tons and tons of value, lots of valuable companies, and a lot of wealthy investors. But backing up a little bit, I think what we're getting at here is that there's a fair amount of luck involved in markets, right? Sure. And while you can have some skill and it might help you a little bit, at the end of the day, there's a great quote by Michael Malbison, and I think he got it from Annie Duke, who wrote a book about betting and making bets.
Sure.
She's a poker player. But it's something like trying to decide whether there's skill or luck involved in a game. And if you can fail on purpose, that means there's skill involved.
Yeah.
Now, in stock picking, you can pick a stock and you can think that you're going to fail, and you may not. Like, it might actually go up, right? And it's like on gambling, on the roulette table, you can put money on 27, and you can be like, it's never going to hit 27. And then it hits 27. And you're like, so there's definitely luck involved. This is not, that's why you have to diversify. You have to own, safer assets and as well as some slightly risky. You have to create a portfolio that is like, so there's like so many layers of knowledge that you kind of need to get. You need the basic accounting, you need the basic kind of how to look at a company, how to understand the capital structure, where are your rights if things turn to shit. As an equity holder, they're at the bottom. But then also like, how do you put a portfolio together of companies, and like, how do you construct that in a way that minimizes the risk, and you're not like totally on China consumer risk or totally on China media risk, or just China risk. Like, you want to diversify away from big themes and buckets, and
But yeah, I mean, that's principle number one, right? Is basically work, save, invest, diversify, hold. Like, pretty much. But yeah, so
you should invest in things that you like that are fun. And that doesn't mean stocks. I mean, like, if you want to, if you like surfing, you should invest in maybe a property near like a beach, or invest in, something that's kind of related to surfing. You can do interesting things that are fun and that add value outside of return, to your life. So, you want to, like, it's not all about money and like making more money. Like, there should be, what is the point of money? Money is kind of like a vehicle to something. It can be a vehicle to more freedom, to spending time with your family. It could be to giving your kids like a good education. It can be, there's like a lot of giving away and like being philanthropic. There's a lot of things you can do with money that are not just putting a pile of it and locking it in a safe,
May we all be blessed with
luck,
with those sorts of those sorts of challenges.
Yeah.
Elliot and James, thanks so much for coming on ChinaEconTalk.
Thanks,
Jordan.
It is China Econ Tech Investor on this episode.
Right.
It's a crossover episode. All right.
Thanks for coming on China Econ Tech Investor, everybody.
Thanks for doing this podcast, everyone.